Hey everyone, so today's video is going to just be a really quick bonus video for this week. I am making a book cover for my novel Feeding Habits. Just want to pop in here to give a disclaimer. This book is not published. This was not for like a self-published book cover or whatever. It will never be published. I just made this book cover for myself. It's just for personal use. It is the sequel to Mothwork, so I wanted them to look similar. This is the original book cover, and you guys will see me making the book cover for book 2, which is Feeding Habits. So I hope you guys enjoy this process video. I'm gonna first start out by showing you how I painted the portraits that are on the book cover, and then we'll get into assembly. So let's jump right into how I made this book cover for Feeding Habits. Alright, so as usual, I'm starting the painting off in Krita. Krita is a free painting software, and that's where I've been doing all of my digital art for a few years. So I've started with a portrait of Lonan, and he was actually the easiest to draw. He was the first person that I drew, and I was actually surprised by how easy it was. It took me about 3 hours and 40 minutes, including the painting and the coloring. Even though I did all the coloring yesterday, I painted this portrait a few weeks ago. I couldn't find the photographer of the reference, and I'm pretty sad about that because this portrait follows the reference quite closely, so I feel really bad about that. So if anyone knows the photographer, please put their name in the comments. I know that the model is Ruben Ramaker. I might be saying his name wrong. I wish that the portrait in the end didn't look so much like the reference, but it was kind of difficult for me because the reference looks a lot like him. I adjusted some features like the nose and some parts of the mouth, but the picture itself actually looks a lot like Lonan. Really, painting this was not dissimilar to how I usually paint everything. I start with a big blob of color, which is why all of the portraits in the beginning look a little bit bizarre. It's kind of funny to see how they progress. Then I use that basically as a sketch, a basis, and after I have in those basic values, I go in feature by feature and I sort of micro paint everything. Coloring it, I obviously do black and white to color, and so I am just in Photoshop putting in some color overlays, and I've done this in a lot of my other speed paints. I just wanted to include this part because in the last cover I did for Mothwork, I didn't record speed paints, so I hope that that's helpful for you guys. So now we're moving on to Eliza, and so she was actually a bit tricky to draw. If you don't know, Eliza is a central character in Mothwork. I don't talk about her very frequently, but she's Lonan's girlfriend, and so she was a little bit tricky. I did have a really good reference for her. The photographer is Victor Zock. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, so I'm sorry about that, but he's a photographer on Unsplash, so this is a stock photo. So I ended up using that as a reference, but it was a bit tricky because I had to Photoshop. The reference that you're seeing on screen right now is photoshopped her head onto somebody else's body because the photo itself doesn't show her shoulders, and so I needed more of her shoulders in the final cover because I knew what I wanted the composition to look like, so that was a bit tricky. Her face in the beginning was not really working for me. I was not very happy with it. After some time rendering, I actually really enjoyed how the Eliza portrait turned out, and this is the first time I painted Eliza in the second time I've ever drawn her, and I was actually really happy with how it turned out because she ended up looking a lot like a sketch that I drew of her, which I've shared on here before, and that was the first time I'd ever drawn her, so I think I nailed her likeness. I'm pretty happy with it. But again, it's just starting with those big shapes and then really rendering feature by feature. Some people do all the features at once. I prefer to nail one feature and then continue. It's really dependent on your process. Sometimes I will shift between using the soft airbrush and the like harder oil brushes. Honestly, I just want a little bit of texture on the face. I don't want it to look too super soft, but it doesn't have to be like very textured. That's not really in my style. She was pretty simple to paint, honestly. After I finished her face, it was just sort of getting her body rendered and her like sort of shawl thing. Really happy when it ended up turning out, and I think the colored version of her looks amazing. So now we're on to Harrison, who I drew last, but he was a nightmare to draw. He was so hard. I drew him 3 times, and this is the 3rd attempt, so I had 2 other versions of him. I'm using a reference of Hugh Dancy. Hugh Dancy is my face claim for Harrison. I was using a different reference of Hugh Dancy. I was using a screen cap from Hannibal, and I was really hoping I could make it work because I liked his expression in the reference. I'll pop it on the screen, but I couldn't make it work. Every single portrait, I did 2 of them. It was so bad. I couldn't do it. I couldn't render the face. It was something with the lighting, maybe. I don't know. The angle of the portrait was just not working for me. So I ended up restarting all over again. I probably spent about 6 hours or more on both of those portraits combined. I was like, you know what, I'm not happy with this. So I just started over a few weeks of taking a break, maybe like a week and a half, 2 weeks of taking a break from this. And I started with a new reference of obviously Huion H610. Again, I don't know the photographer. I tried looking with the both. I tried reverse image searching. I couldn't find the photographer's name. I just started with that reference. And how I do these sorts of things when I know that the photo looks a lot like the character. With the Eliza one, I had to change up a few things from the photo because it wasn't exact. With Huion H610, with Ruben Ramaker, they look quite similar to the character. So what I do in those instances, I copy perfectly what the reference looks like, and I do that in realism or semi-hyper realism, whatever. Then I will change it after I've finished rendering the whole thing, because I just will make subtle changes so that it looks more like the character and less like the reference, just so that I'm getting values and everything right. I will copy the photo first, and then I will go in and change things. I used a lot of shortcuts with Harrison. I copied his earring from the last portrait. I copied his jacket from him on Mothwork. I was really lazy, and I had a lot of fun drawing him. So now let's move on to the construction of the book cover. So I'm in Photoshop, and a while back I decided obviously what the composition was, and that was Eliza and Lonan on the front cover. So I actually used the template from the last book cover I did making the Mothwork dust jacket, because I didn't feel like remeasuring things. So I just started, like I said, Photoshop with this template, and I just dragged them in to the template and sort of resized them. I had to do a bit of touch-up work on the portraits itself, some erasing and stuff like that. I added Eliza's tattoos, and so really I was focusing my energy primarily in the beginning on the front cover, because obviously that's what I want to look awesome. I think Mothwork looks better as a spread, but I think Feeding Habits, it looks even good as the single cover. So really what did the brunt work, just like with the Mothwork book cover, was this photo of a forest. So the last time I used like these trees on like water, like they're reflected in the water, and that was carrying through in the background, and so that's what I chose this time around. I knew I wanted a green color scheme, sort of more woodsy, and so that was the background image. I was actually hoping to do sheep in the background. That didn't end up working out. A lot of the Mothwork book cover, the original, has a lot of light flares. There's some rim lighting on the characters, and there's a light source on the spine. So I have two light sources on this book cover. I have one on the spine, and I have one between Lonan and Eliza. So, you know, it's a little bit unrealistic, but that's okay. A lot of this was just using the gradient tool to create like circular light flares, and then it was just sort of adding the lettering, and I followed this same sort of movement as the original, where the lettering sort of goes diagonally upward, and that was what worked best for me. Later I will go on to add a treatment sort of to the text. I make it like bevel and emboss, sort of, so it has that raised metal feel. That's also what I did with Mothwork. So I might have used like a gold leaf overlay on Mothwork, because I didn't know how to use bevel and emboss back then, but now I do. So I did that on here, and I used the yellow color just to match the color scheme. I think obviously Mothwork has that gold and blue, and Feeding Habits is the gold and the green, which I think is actually pretty accurate to the book too. I don't know, the vibes that I'm getting. But yeah, it was like the original, just a lot of playing around with the text placement, and that took me a while, honestly. I really wasn't sure of anything, any decision I was making. Like, you can see me going back and forth with these sheep a lot, and that's because I really wanted a sheep on the cover, but it was just not happening, because, you know, Mothwork has the moth, and then Feeding Habits is definitely a sheep. So it was just trying things and going back on it, and this cover was actually really easy to make until I made a fatal error, which you guys will see in a bit. And so what happened, I will just start explaining because it's a bit of a long story. I was trying to add a feather overlay, which I will start adding in a bit. And what I did is I cropped the book cover, and I do this often when I'm making like this spread. I remember when I was doing the dust jacket for Mothwork, I would crop so I could just see the front cover to make sure that the front cover like looked solid enough on its own. I left it cropped and continued to work after that, so I basically erased completely the spine and back cover. Thankfully, I only had like what you're seeing right now, just the text on the spine, nothing on the back. I had to kind of rejig that with some Photoshop magic and sort of make it look as if I hadn't deleted the entire thing and make it look continuous, because I wanted it to look nice. So now that I'm just rambling to you, I just guess I should talk to you about the project. So Feeding Habits I started in April of this year. I was hoping to finish it by the end of July, but I haven't really worked on it very much this week in a capacity that I'm very happy with, and so I don't think that that goal is very feasible anymore. And basically Feeding Habits follows primarily, and like obviously the part that I've written, this dude named Lonan, and he's on the front, he's on the left. So if you're just coming across this video, that's Lonan. And so I have an entire video on moth work, and this is a part of that series, which is a part of another series. It gets complicated. If you want to learn more, I will link the all about my novel in the description. Lonan is in this relationship with this woman named Eliza, who's on the right of him, and it is not a very good relationship. It's a bit toxic. It's kind of weird. It's not really the best situation. He ends up sort of latching on to this relationship he has with another woman who he befriends, and it's actually a friend from his past, and she ends up calling him, and they have this sort of relationship over the phone where he kind of helps her in her toxic situation, and he kind of feels responsible mostly because this woman has a child, and he feels some sort of, I don't know, obligation, fatherly obligation in some sense. It's a bit complicated, and so hopefully I can make an all about my novel on this novel soon, because it kind of is hard to explain in very little time. But while he's focusing on this other relationship, which is a platonic, it's a friendship, he's sort of wading through this toxic romance. And so the other half of the book follows Harrison, and I'm just starting writing Harrison's point of view, and I just want to give this disclaimer now. You're going to be able to see the blurb on the back. I'll put it in the description if you want to read it too. I have no idea if the Harrison section of this blurb is going to be accurate at all, because I haven't written his section very much yet. So Harrison, on the other hand, is having a hard time in his new restart in New York City. He's supposed to be having the time of his life, and yet he feels kind of stilted. He is not having the time of his life, and he realizes it's because, you know, something's missing in his life, and that something may or may not be Lonan. So he has to kind of decide whether or not he wants to re-engage in that relationship. So yeah, this book cover was a lot of fun for me to make. It was a lot of overlays, man. The feather overlays was actually a lot of fun to make, because I took a single feather stock image. I couldn't find like a exploding feathers thing, like an overlay for free. I couldn't find that online, and so I was like, let me just make my own. So I found one single stock image of a photo, and I just kind of kept moving it and making it smaller, whatever, so that it kind of looked like this cannon of feathers, and I ended up really liking how that turned out. I love the movement, the downward diagonal movement from the top right to the bottom left. I think that really works compositionally. I'm in love with the colors here. I love the green and I love the gold. I'm really liking the lighting too, so I'm happy with how this turned out. But I love the spine with the feathers on it. I think it looks awesome. When I was able to put the sheep on the back cover, so I was really hyped about that. But I ended up loving how this book cover turned out, and I hope you guys love it too, because I had so much fun making it. In total, it took me about 17 hours to make. It was a bit of time commitment, but I had a lot of fun making it. Every single time I make a new book cover, I learn something new. So like I said, I have a video making the Mothwork book cover if you want to see how I made book one. A link in the description, and you can watch that and let me know, do you think that they match? Do you think it looks like a series? I'm actually pretty ecstatic with how they turned out. I think it looks amazing. So thanks for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!